Yes, good afternoon or morning or evening, depending where you are. And welcome to the third in a series of webinars that the National Sleep Research Resource have been hosting to introduce the community, particularly the sleep community, to common data elements. As we've said before, we are embracing the notion that these three webinars are an introduction to lay a foundation for future engagement and work as the community works together to develop, adopt, utilize, and refine common data elements. So I like to first really give a shout out to my own team, including Paige Sparks, who's been managing this, and many other individuals, including Ying Zhang, who I will introduce in a moment, as well as our close collaborators at our RTI and UNC and National Library of Medicine and NHLBI. And you've heard from some of them, and you will hear more today as well. And finally, our collaborators at the Sleep Research Society Sleep Research Network. So today, what we're going to have is we're going to have two presentations that are going to be talking about artificial intelligence tools to help expedite the development of the CDEs. And then we're going to wrap up at the end with a discussion of a recap and some next steps. And we really do invite your questions and input, and we ask you as you have questions to put them into the Q&A box, the chat area. So at this moment, I'm going to introduce my close collaborator and really a key leader in the data core team of the National Sleep Research Resource, which is Dr. Ying Zhang. Dr. Zhang is a data scientist with expertise in modeling data and has been working very, very closely with the keynote speaker today, who she will actually introduce. So Dr. Zhang.
Thank you, Susan. I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Ann Thessen is an associate professor at UNC Chapel Hill in the Department of Genetics. She's one of the multi-PIs for the Biodata Catalyst Data Management Core, where she spends most of her day thinking about how to integrate data at scale. Please welcome Dr. Ann Thessen.
Thank you so much, Ying. Let me share my slides here. Okay. All right, good afternoon. Thank you for attending my talk today. I'm going to talk today about some work that I've been doing with Ying using agentic AI to create some CDEs for sleep data using LinkML microschemas. I'll go through and explain what all this stuff is, and then I'll hand it over to Ying, and so she can go into some specifics about some sleep specific variables, and then I'll finish up the talk. The title that I have here is quite a bit different from what was in the schedule, but the content will remain the same. Okay, so first of all, we've come a long way, but we've come a long way going from distributed data to aggregated data to integrated data, but we've still got a long way to go. There are thousands of databases and thousands of standards, hundreds of ontologies, and tens of thousands of CDEs. And all of these different things out there in the world don't necessarily have any mappings that link them together. For example, if you look for date of birth in the NLM CDE repository, you'll get 28 different CDEs. If you look in the ontologies and bioportal, you'll find 49 different ontologies have this term. And so there's a lot of overlap, a lot of repetition. And so the data that use these infrastructures are still not integrated, nor are they interoperable. There we go. Now, CDEs can help with this problem, but they are underspecified. Now, CDEs have a really good governance and validation approaches, but working with CDEs is still largely manual, which means that's not a very scalable thing to do. There are many overlapping CDE repositories, like at the National Library of Medicine, CADSR, Phoenix, etc. And when you look at these CDEs, you'll see that the context and the metadata are implied, and that includes mappings and provenance, and et cetera. And this sort of reliance on human knowledge limits data interoperability at scale, and that's exactly what we want to achieve. So we need to make all this stuff, all this information explicit, and mapping CDEs is necessary for this interoperability. And when you go to map something like a CDE, you have to map things on multiple levels. It's very rarely a one-to-one mapping. So first you've got data model alignments. For example, one model might have a sample to diagnosis, while another model has sample to case and diagnosis to case. You also need value set alignments because each source might use a different value. For example, race is a very common example of this. For one question, might give 4 options for race, while another question gives many more options for race. And sometimes these are overlapping and not a one-to-one relation. Now here we have many CDEs for blood pressure. These are just a small sample of the blood pressure CDEs available in the National Library of Medicine CDE repository. And as a human, I know that a blood pressure measurement is made up of a systolic measurement and a diastolic measurement. And I know what a blood pressure mean measurement would be. But I have no idea, but the machine doesn't know this. The relationship between these 4 things is not codified in any or made explicit in any sort of way. And it's also relates to other types of CDEs. Like here we have vital signs type where blood pressure is a part of this. But again, it's just sort of, it's not captured in a machine readable way. So making these CDEs computable and making explicit how they relate to each other and what they are will scale up the interoperability of the data that use these CDEs. And so now we can take advantage of different knowledge modeling languages, tools, and services in order to do this. We can now capture much of the detail and nuance in the data that you couldn't before, and we can leverage the power of reasoners, transformers, and compliance checkers in order to automate things like QA/QC, inference, search, versioning, and format changes downstream. So if we make these CDEs semantically interoperable, then we can make the data that use them interoperable at scale, which is essential for being AI ready. Okay, so a note on terminology. I'm going to use 3 terms here. CDE, of course, is a measurement value or question and answer pair that has been thoroughly vetted by the community. And this might be something like a waist circumference measurement. A variable is any measurement in a data set, and it might have any number of labels, like here, WCirc might be the label for this, and you have as many variables as you do data sets for any number of things, and so a variable might conform to a CDE. A microschema is a CDE represented in LinkML, and I'm about to go through what that means in just a minute. But those are the 3 things that I want to make sure we don't get confused about. Okay, so our proposal, again, is these LinkML microschema. LinkML is a simple, flexible, agnostic modeling language written in YAML, which is human and machine readable. And it also comes with a suite of supportive tooling in order to create, manage, and export models and data. It allows for the capture of everything needed in a CDE. But this isn't just about the CDE, it also supports the data to which you apply the CDE. And so there's tools there for validation, data conversion, code generation, data entry tooling, and schema inference. And these links at the bottom of the page will tell you much more about LinkML and how it works and all the things that you can do with it. So here in the middle, there's some example YAML. LinkML is made up of classes, and those classes have slots. So here's an example class for a person. A class is essentially anything, a named entity. And a person has attributes. That's what these slots are. So we're declaring that there is a thing called a person, and it has an ID, a name, a primary email, etc., etc. You can also define these slots. Okay, and so this is some of these slots defined here, like the ID slot is required. It has a range URI or query, and here's the description, a unique identifier for a person. Birth date, every person has a birth date. The range is a date, and the description is date on which a person is born. Now, those are two different data types that can be used in LinkML. You can also have enumerative values. This is sort of like having a controlled vocabulary. You can have a string, or you can have a decimal. So when you set range date for birth date, that means that this slot is always going to contain a date. And if it doesn't contain a date, if it contains a decimal or something like that, then this validation tooling that is available in LinkML is going to tell you that there is an error if it encounters data that has anything other than a date in this birth date slot. So lots of people are using LinkML, and I'm only really showing this slide so that you get an idea of the size of the community. There are lots of open source developers working on LinkML. It's very active and exciting, and I really enjoy working with it. So ontologies relate to LinkML because they can provide the enumerated values and the logical structure for some of these CDEs. Now, before I mentioned that an enum, or an enumerated value, was a possible range for something. So a person could have a family relationship so family relationship could be a slot, and the range would be familial relationship, some sort of familial relationship type. That means that the only thing that can be in that slot is sibling of, parent of, child of. And the meaning is set by these ontology terms here from the kin ontology. And I think this is a made-up ontology, but you can use an ontology term to define any class or any slot. And this is a way that you can root things in some sort of a semantic reality. The other really interesting thing is that you can use what's called a dynamic enum. Let's say you have a slot that is neuron type, and the range is neuron type enum. You don't want to have to list out every neuron type from the cell ontology. So what you can do is just say it's going to be any child of this identifier from the cell ontology, which is neuron. And that makes things a little bit easier. So LinkML defines the structure, the schema of the data, and ontologies are used to codify what all the slots and all the classes are in some sort of a semantic structure. And so we want to build on that foundation to make the implicit in these CDEs explicit. So, for example, humans know that BMI is kilograms divided by meters squared. We want to make that computable and place it in the context of previous work. So we want to create computable CDEs using LinkML and create mappings between CDEs and variables and other CDEs. And we want to do this using an open community-driven approach. The strategies used by the Obo Foundry are a good example. And we also want there to be plenty of documentation so people can learn about this as we go and make sense of all of this work that's being done. And part of the accompanying tooling with LinkML is this way to automatically create documentation. So here's an example of a web page that would be created using the example person class that we looked at before. And that's automatically created documentation. Okay, so now I'm going to dive a little bit more into some experimenting that I've been doing with microschema. And I want to specify that this is all under development. So I haven't had the chance to really exercise this yet, but we're gonna talk through it here. Okay, so I've defined a couple of microschema metaclasses for describing CDEs. So as we talked before that CDEs are these question answer pairs or measurement value pairs. So this is what we call a metaclass to represent those pairs. So this is microschema definition. This would be like the question or the measurement. And this is the value microschema definition. This would be like the answer or the value. You can see that both of these meta classes are abstract, so they're not really real things. And that's a little strange, but it'll come into play later. And so these are the two parts, and then the value microschema definition. So the values can be any one of these four types: a quantity, a time point, a time interval, or a coded value. And you can see here that each of these four value types instantiates a value microschema definition. Okay, so these are the meta classes. Most people will never even know that these exist because this is basic abstract infrastructure. So let's get a little more specific here. Here's a clinical measurement parent class. Now, I'm going to show clinical measurements because that's what we're all familiar with here, but theoretically, you could do a microschema for data from any discipline. And I do have colleagues that are looking at creating environmental microschema for environmental variables as well, but we won't be talking about that today. So here we have a clinical measurement record instantiating a microschema definition. And I've set up here, if you remember, the microschema definition has a slot domain of use, and I've said that this is clinical, and then I've defined the following slots for a clinical measurement record. I haven't made anything required or anything like that, and the slots are all defined over here. So a subject identifier, an identifier for the subject of the datum. Measurement type is a URI or query, and then there's unit, method, instrument, and so on and so forth. Okay, that is still very high level. So let's get maybe a little more specific with human body height record. So this is a clinical measurement record. Now this is different from instantiating. Is hierarchical. That means that human body height record is inheriting all of those slots and all of that information that I defined for clinical measurement record. And now here, and this is a bit experimental, I'm using something called LinkML rules. Now I have my handy little Komodo dragon here to show that there be dragons because I don't quite have these working yet. I'm still experimenting with them, but I'm using LinkML rules to computationally encode metadata. And rules have two parts, the preconditions and the postconditions. And the preconditions is like if, and postcondition is like then. So these are if-then statements, essentially. So what I'm saying is if the measurement type is any of these identifiers, and these are identifiers that correspond to body height, and we can add more, whatever your favorite identifier is. So if if the measurement type is body height, then the unit has got to be one of these. The instrument has got to be one of these. The body position needs to be body position enum. And the data type is going to be a decimal. And then here I've placed a minimum value and a maximum value. So what does that do for us? What that does is the LinkML validator will give me an error if it finds data that is listed as a body height record, but the unit is in milliliters or something like that, or the instrument is a spectrophotometer, or if I get a negative height measurement. But this is still very, very, not very, very high level, but it still is not the same, quite the level of specificity that we might want. So let's take it one more level down. We can have a human body height record. One is a human body height record. So here I'm inheriting, again, I'm inheriting all of those slots and all of those rules that we set before for human body height record, only this time I'm being more specific. So if I have a human body record, if the instrument is a wall-mounted stadiometer, the body position is standing, then I close the window of acceptable values here based on this instrumentation. And you can imagine that there could be several human body height records with a different measurement value distribution based on what instrument was being used. And if something is outside of those rules, then I get a validation error. And that very much helps for keeping your data clean and AI ready. But what about calculated values? So LinkML has another really cool function called the LinkML expressions. And so I have here body mass index record is a clinical measurement record. And I have my if measurement type is BMI, then the unit has to be this. The method has to be calculated. The data type is decimal, and then I've given my range. And then you have this calculated from, where it equals expression. And here I reference other microschema, the body weight record divided by the human body height record. And that's in centimeters. So I change that to meters and then square it. So that makes all of that information about height and weight and BMI explicit in the microschema. So let's take a look. Now that we've sort of gone over some very basic stuff about microschema, let's take a look at what existing sleep CDEs there are in the National Library of Medicine CDE repository. I just went there and searched for sleep. I got 671 results. You might know what all of these are. I certainly do not, and it is not clear to me what they are, how they relate to each other. And if you click on one to try to get more information, there's a lot here that's not filled in. It's still not really very clear to me what this is or how I should use it. So it would be very helpful to have some sleep CDEs. And I think that I would like to present a proposed workflow here with Ying to make these sleep CDEs into microschema and to do so at scale. So NSRR, as you know, has an excellent data resource at sleepdata.org with extensive metadata. And this is exactly what you need in order to create a comprehensive sleep CDE resource. But this still requires substantial human curation to go from these variable summary tables to a comprehensive sleep CDEs / microschema. Can artificial intelligence help us scale up this task? Yes. And we'll show you how we did that in just a moment. But we're not using LLMs, we're using agentic AI, which is one step above LLMs. But the agentic AI doesn't just stop at answering a question like ChatGPT might. It can use reasoning, tool integration, and planning to independently execute workflows. Claude Code is agentic AI and can help, but you do have to work together as though Claude is a collaborator. And let's take a look at what I mean here. So Ying and I worked together to try to get Claude to do what we needed it to do. The very first prompt was basically just, we told Claude to make a link-ML schema based on the study level and variable level metadata from NSRR. Of course, that's not the exact prompt texts. These prompts can be quite long and they're not going to fit on a slide. So I'm paraphrasing. This first prompt created some small reusable components, but overall not really what we wanted. Claude was much more successful if you worked with it iteratively and broke down the tasks into smaller subtasks. So then we asked Claude to make a list of the studies with variable lists and gave some examples of what a study was and what a variable was. And then we said, okay, take this list that you made, and for each of these studies on the list, make another list of categorical variables and continuous variables with the metadata. And then we gave examples of that as well, so that it was clear what we meant by categorical variables and continuous variables and metadata. And we had to go back and forth and kind of manually curate and work with Claude a bit. It did some silly things we didn't tell it to, like cutting off at 100 variables per study. So you have to be careful that it might be doing something that you didn't tell it to do. But when we were happy with these lists and the collected metadata, we asked Claude to go through those lists and create the link-ML schema from the list rather than directly from the variable tables. So now, at this point, we've got our link-ML schema, but it still wasn't quite right. And this is when Ying really came in and provided some more domain-specific prompt language. And there's much more detail, and she'll be able to go into that. But she basically specified, gave Claude a primary goal and some critical rules to follow. She specified the use of the folder hierarchy for clustering. And then she defined some core link-ML classes like instrument and scoring protocol, just to get things started. And again, there was much more. And we continued with a few rounds of iteration. But finally, we got some results that, of course, are still in development. These results can be found in GitHub. I have yet to apply the developments in the microschema meta model. So if you go there and look today, it will probably wind up maybe looking slightly different, but I'm not too terribly concerned about that. And I would like to invite this community to use this as a starting point for creating sleep CDs, because some human curation will be needed. Here is a CDE or a link-ML class or a microschema describing arousal metric. And this is not something that Claude did all by itself. This is microschema that received some human curation from Ying and from some other of Ying's colleagues. So it's not, it still is going to require some human curation. And now I'm going to hand over the slides to Ying so she can go into more detail about that process.
Thank you, Anne. So now I'm going to share a few slides to provide more context in terms of what information was fed into Cloud and what came out of it. So as Anne just introduced earlier, our goal is to really leverage the rich NSRR curated metadata to help Cloud to understand what are the key polysomnography terms. Here we focus on polysomnography because it's the most well annotated data on NSRR, and then understand how they are related to one another. Also to distinguish the core terms versus reusable modifiers, and to preserve the desirable granularity in the sleep terms. So specifically, we focus on ingesting the concept map. That's the folder structure and just mentioned. It's basically a nested folder structure that NSRR developed to organize variables across data sets in a standardized way, which I will show in the next slide. And also we assign semantic tags to some of the sleep variables. And then the second is the coded modifiers. It's basically a framework we developed to code the variable level metadata and some study level metadata in a way that the metadata is more machine readable compared to like a really long paragraph of text, which we also ingested into the AI pipeline. That's the enriched metadata, which incorporate things like ASM guidelines versioning, reference, and so on. So here is an example of the folder structure slash concept map for polysomnography variables. You can see here on the left that we have defined sort of parent folder and child folder and then subfolders so that related variables are clustered together. And then on the right-hand side, there are two examples of the actual path or folder path will look like for each variables. So all the AHIs will get assigned the first one, like the sleep circadian studies, polysomnography, sleep disorder breathing, and then apnea hypopnea frequency indices, while like sleep duration or latency will get assigned the sleep architecture folder path. We also incorporated our previous work on harmonizing polysomnography data, especially AHIs. So the table here is try to summarize the key differences and the hypopnea definitions over the years based on the ASM guidelines. The diagram trying to visualize the key varying components for those AHI definitions. So even though we start with just AHI is our main term, but we ended up having 7 versions for AHIs. And those code is what we ingested into the AI pipeline. And all this work is published on the Sleep Journal in 2024, if you're interested to get more details on. Then here's a screenshot of the enriched metadata that we ingested. So this one is a harmonized AHI variable. It provides, the detailed definition for hypopnea events and also the references for the ASM guidelines. And then we have this sort of compositional code that indicate what kind of data source, what kind of hypopnea definition, what threshold they use, so that the machine can understand how this AHI is different from another one. So here is sort of more detailed example to show how Cloud now can understand the difference between key or canonical Ph.D. term versus reusable modifiers and how different canonical terms are grouped together. So the upper left one is AHI. So Cloud understand AHI is a main kind of canonical term. And then it also identifies some common modifiers that can be combined with this AHI to kind of give different permutations of AHI that you will actually see in a real data set. So identify the apnea type, hypopnea definition, specifically which ASM guideline it's consistent with, and then desaturation threshold and arousal requirement, and then the body position and sleep stage. So I would say when I see this, it's pretty impressive that it captured the desirable granularity that we want to see in a AHI variable. And then the lower left corner is, I think, understand closely clustered variables. That is the respiratory event metrics that contains, the AHI and then also the apnea index, hypopnea index, and respiratory event count, and also what the modifiers that usually go with them. And then on the right-hand side is the list of modifiers that were specified in the canonical terms. And I also want to show one more thing is the actual values Cloud identified for each of those modifiers. I think for the sleep stage, it's pretty straightforward. And then also the body position. What's interesting is the polysomnography type. It was able to extract the study level metadata we coded in the label to capture is it type 1, 2, or 3? And then also the hypopnea definition, which ASM guideline is it recommended or alternative. Those were also preserved in the modifier slot. And then the desaturation, and then arousal requirement. So in general, I think when we reviewed this, we were really impressed by what cloud can do just by ingesting all the NSRR curated metadata. Of course, it's not perfect. There's still require expert review, but I think overall it's very promising. Give a good foundation for the sleep community to start thinking about the design of the sleep CDEs, especially for the polysomnography and actigraphy data. So that's all the demo I want to do and hand it back to Anne.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me pull up my slides again here. All right, so now I'm going to show hide floating meeting controls. Okay, show some work that we've done to support another community that is similar to yours, to NSRR in many ways, but in some ways NSRR is ahead of them. So this is all also under development. So things are moving very quickly. But this is the CureGN group. It's funded by NIDDK, and they look at autoimmune kidney diseases, and they're essentially trying to integrate multiple kidney disease related data sets in order to better treat autoimmune kidney diseases. And so they're trying to do a lot of the work that NSRR has already done for sleep. And similar to NSRR, they're dealing with lots of different data sets and thousands of different variables. And they're trying to figure out what kind of CDE coverage already exists and where the gaps are. And so they would like to be able to take all these variables and how do they align to existing CDEs? And then also how can we make these data more computable and AI ready? And so one thing that my colleague Madan has done, who's in our lab, is creating machine learning embeddings from these variables and clustering them. And so each cluster here is a potential CDE. So every dot is a variable, and then similar variables clustered together. And so that might be a CDE candidate. So here we have like clinical observations, medications, lab measures, things of that nature. And so he did this analysis and found that the majority of CureGN variables didn't really match with any existing CDEs. And so there's quite a long way that this group has to go in order to have some sort of representation of all the variables in their kidney-related data sets. And so another thing that another part of this is being able to add bindings to these variables to standard terminologies. Here we see a bunch of LOINC codes, but we would also want to include bindings to different ontologies and maybe some other terminologies as well. And this just helps to aid interoperability so that we can all understand very explicitly what these CDEs are and how they relate to each other and how they relate to variables. Because these variables, there's just not a one-to-one mapping between variables and CDEs, and there's not a one-to-one mapping between CDEs. And you can really see that here in this example where we're looking at, data set one, and here we're just looking at cholesterol measurements for the example, and data set two, where there's HDL concentration in both data sets. But this data set says, have you ever taken statins? Yes, no. And this one says, are you currently taking lipid lowering medications? Yes, no. And then this one says, how long did you fast today? And this one says, did you fast before the appointment? So you can see, again, I'm sure you all understand that these questions are similar, but not exactly the same. And we're experimenting right now with using these microschemas and to define these things and say like how they relate to each other and how they relate to other things. Here's for the HDL concentration, this is a mapping, a SCOS exact match to a Phoenix CDE and close match to a LOINC code. And this is like hot off the presses, but this is our how we are thinking about minting identifiers for microschema so that we can make a resource that other people can use and reference. And so this microschema, these three microschema would then be a subclass of this microschema, which is blood lipid related variables, which is a bundle. So that's sort of what we're thinking and the direction that we think we're going to go in with this. Okay, so in conclusion, CDEs are underspecified and many disciplines do not have all the CDEs that they need. Microschemas described using LinkML make the implicit explicit and are AI ready. Agentic AI can be used to increase the scale of microschema creation, but human curation of AI outputs is still needed. The benefits of using microschema and making your data AI ready in terms of increased data interoperability will be enormous. And I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators here at NSRR, the Berkeley Bioinformatics Open Source Projects, TISLab, of course, the Monarch Initiative, which laid much of the groundwork for this, the LinkML developer community, all my collaborators at RTI International, and NIH for funding so much work in this field. And with that, I don't know if you want to take questions or if you want to.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anne. That was really a fantastic talk, and thank you, Ying, as well. So we have some questions in the Q&A box, so I will I can read through them. I think most of them probably are from Anne, but Ying, please chime in. And then after we finish these, and so please put any other questions in the Q&A box. After we address these, I'm going to do a quick wrap up with some next steps to kind of propel us forward. So, and the first question is from Xing Sang, who asks, does the link ML schema overlap with Fire resource to some degree?
It does to some degree. There are people working on what we call exporters. So during my talk, I said that LinkML was somewhat agnostic, and that means that it can export data in a variety of formats. So TSV, RDF, JSON, If you have a favorite format that you want your data in, then you or someone else can write an exporter to take data, LinkML compliant data, and then just export it in your favorite format. And I believe I remember that someone is currently working on a Fire exporter, so that data in a LinkML format can be exported to Fire.
Thank you. Okay. Hashi's son asks, does Sleep CDE allow adding new markers, say, from a new paper, if someone comes up with say, a new way of calculating like a measure such as hypoxic burden, version 2?
Yes. And that is part of how these things are designed. Any good standard, any good schema is a living standard or schema, and so it is entirely expected that new CDEs would be created, existing CDEs would be updated and edited, and that's all part of the process and totally expected.
Thank you, Anne. And the last question is from Diego Mazzotti, and that may relate to some of the next steps that I will talk about, but perhaps Anne or Ying, you might just want to briefly comment. He writes, this is really impressive work. It seems like it developed sleep-specific ontologies much faster than what the community could do. Is there any utility in using prior developed ontologies to further accelerate this process, such as the OBO Foundry-based sleep domain ontology? And also, how do you envision the process for expert review to be consensus or each item curated individually?
So I am not familiar with the sleep domain ontology, but I definitely recommend using it in the same way that uh, I gave the example of how the cell ontology or the kin ontology was used. And so all of the sleep-related classes and slots can be defined using a query from the sleep domain ontology. And it's more about having your schema and saying it's this variable, and then having a definition like a class URI or a slot URI saying, oh, by the way, this thing is the same as this thing in the sleep domain ontology. And as far as the process, I mean, that's part of what you can decide as a community, how you want to handle the development of your CDEs or your microschema. I know that NIH has its own sort of CDE approval process that you would have to abide by, if that's the direction that you want to go in. But as far as creating the microschema, um, that's something that you can come up with as a community. You don't have to rely on the CDE process entirely.
Yeah, I also want to chime in. I think during this project, we used the NSRR folder structure is basically a proxy for ontology because we didn't map all the variables to ontology, references. So we used the folder structure. So I think in the future iteration, we can incorporate, ontology to make the clustering more precise. So I think that's definitely one way to improve the workflow. And then I think the second question probably is a good bridge to Susan, your talk next.
Okay, thank you. And I don't want to overpromise because my talk is about the need for the community to just make some of these decisions. So let me now do kind of a recap of where we are. Okay. Just trying to, okay. So as a brief recap, I think over the last three webinars, we have learned and reinforced that CDs facilitate adherence to FAIR principles, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which as researchers enhances the rigor and reproducibility of what we do. And it also, especially through interoperability and standardization, really promotes data sharing, which is a major goal of our sponsors like the NIH, as well as us as good stewards of data. We've also heard that CDs have facilitated many initiatives, including the HEAL, include the Down syndrome program, COVID-19 research, and many other things, including some initiatives that Anne discussed today. We heard today that the BDC team, particularly Anne, has created some micro schemas and leveraged AI for modeling CDs across multiple domains, which we've heard too is still a work in progress, but quite promising. And you've heard from Ying that NSRR has developed and implemented sleep data models, really curated, defined metadata. We've also created very detailed canonical data dictionaries for a range of sleep data from polysomnography through actigraphy through questionnaires. Now, as people interested in sleep research, I think, have some very strong building blocks to go from. One is we have some widely accepted conceptual frameworks like the Are You Sated framework, as well as practice guidelines, as you know, the ASM guidelines that are, really used in research, but also required for sleep lab certifications. There is increasing use of the promise questionnaires and instruments, as well as other tools. So there is some consensus over instruments that have utility and validity. And there are some standardized physiologic formats for some of our sort of more challenging data, like polysomnography can use EDF and EDF plus. Actigraphy has now open source GGR platforms, and Dr. Purcell, in collaboration with or embedded within NSR, has developed Lunar tools that not only are really open source tools for processing and actually even creating standardized formats for polysomnography data, but he's applying those to actigraphy data too. And as you heard, NSR has already put a lot of energy into really annotating, creating folder structures and metadata. But there are challenges, as we all know. Despite any ASM guidelines and so forth, there's real world variation in actually the PSG and actigraphy data we see in terms of this, even the equipment and the specifics of how these data are collected can vary a lot in polysomnography. Despite standardization, individual labs or even within a lab by bed, by night, can use variable montages, filters, senses, channel names. Home sleep apnea testing now is increasingly used. Maybe 75% of sleep studies in many sleep labs use these home tests that use a wide variety of technology that actually creates huge heterogeneity in the data that we collect. Likewise, actigraphy data, as well as wearables, use many different types of sensors, devices, algorithms, and pre and post processing algorithms. Then, if there is a human involved, we know there's issues of scoring variability, as well as procedures for how things are actually get annotated. And even clinically, we know that AI, for better or for worse, is being integrated into pipelines, but perhaps not necessarily in a standardized way. And then we have our challenges even within our communities of changing definitions, most notoriously the definition of hypopnea that has led to multiple apnea-hypopnea indices, lack of consensus often of what an abnormality is. For example, a short sleep, less than 6 hours or less than 7 hours, and really some semantic challenges even in the vocabulary that we use to describe sleep with terminologies like poor, inadequate, and so forth. We also know across the lifespan, there's a lot of age variation in the appropriateness of different measurement modalities and instruments. And for those interested in using the electronic medical records, sleep data is often very poorly visualized and often not structured. So what are our next steps? For one is that as I mentioned to begin with, we've now set the table with these three webinars, and now we're outreaching to you and others in the community to create a multidisciplinary team so we could begin the work of identifying and prioritizing sleep domain CDEs. And this team will also provide input and maybe the muscle to engage even a larger group, the sleep community, to help with adoption and refinement, provide guidance on what libraries to deposit them, as well as the sort of the overall those overseeing that, and long-term processes for evaluating use and updating. So what we're asking you before you sign off today, we're going to give out a little survey, and Paige will make sure this gets sent out, but we're really looking for you to nominate yourself or your colleague with diverse expertise and let us know of your interests in specific areas like polysomnography, actigraphy, questionnaires, or which subgroups, whether your interest is also more methodologic, for example, in informatics or vocabularies. And as I end, I wanted to underscore a few things that we have learned from Anne and NIH, and that includes we want to learn from others and past experiences. We want to continue to identify the key stakeholders from NIH through professional societies, through patient groups. We do need to explore the governance structure and decision making. I think this got to what Dr. Mazzotti was referring to, and establish, because we want to be able to produce things, our scope, our process, a timetable, and accountability. So thank you. Let us know of your interest, your expertise, and what area you would like to work in. And we will review sort of everything and see what we could do to comprise a usable group. So with that, having said that, I think there is about 2 minutes. Let me see if there's any other Q&As. And there is a comment, and people could read in Q&A, but and then Paige, she's also noted that she's going to be sending out the post-webinar survey, and we really ask you to complete it and consider volunteering you or sending it to a colleague who might be wanting to work on an ongoing basis in this working group. And on that note, I wanted just to again thank Ian and Ying and Paige and each and every of you for the great questions, and for hopefully for some of you, your interest in joining us as we try to make sleep research more rigorous and easier to do and so forth. And actually to be a leader in the field, in the field of CDs.